It's no secret that many players have been complaining about the struggle of being a solo player in Albion Online for a while now. But how much of that is just a classic MMO player's whining, and how much of that is actually indicative of a real problem with the state of solo play in Albion? That's what I want to explore in this video. How good is Albion Online actually for solo players at the current moment? Now, very quickly before we get into the video, if you want to help me out and support me making these videos, I've created a Patreon where you can pledge a certain amount of money per month to sort of help me out. It's not needed, but it is helpful for me if you want to help me extra. So if you're interested, the link is in the description, and while you're at it, join my Discord server where you can win lots of free stuff courtesy of SBI. Okay, so first and foremost, probably the most important aspect to look at when wondering if Albion is good as a solo player game is the PvP, because that's really the highlight of Albion. That's why people play Albion, is for the PvP. If solo play is in a good state, then it will also have good options for PvP. Now, we can't talk about solo PvP in Albion without talking about corrupted dungeons. They are the solo PvP option, a 1v1 arena made specifically for solo players to go up in PvP against each other. Now, in a way, corrupted dungeons are amazing for a solo player. They have some of the best rewards in the game, even looking outside of solo activities. The fame that you get to level up your account is very high. The loot that you get, again, is pretty insane, and it's just a 1v1 arena where you can't be interrupted by other players, which constantly happens in things like the open world. There's also multiple options for the difficulty, a ranking system and leaderboards, pretty much everything a competitive player would want in a 1v1 environment. In a way, corrupted dungeons really only have one real main problem, and unfortunately it's a really big problem to have. They're just not enjoyable. Now, obviously I don't have access to the tools that SBI does or anything like survey data, but I've played this game for a very long time. I've built lots of connections with other people, and I literally have one singular person that I know of that actually enjoys doing corrupted dungeons. Just one. Out of the thousands of people I've met, I only know one person who actually enjoys them. Plenty of people, myself included, play them very occasionally, just go up for a corrupted dungeon to either test a build or just to make some money, as they're really good for rewards, but not many people can actually go and do their main activity as a corrupted dungeon and not hate themselves after a couple days. Now, I'm not going to go into why this is, because that would take way too long, but the point is, the main activity for solo players, especially those that are PvP oriented, just is not fun or not enjoyable for the vast majority of solo players. One of the reasons that this could be is that not many people play an open world full loot PvP game so that they can go do instanced PvP. The selling point for Albion is not its instance content. You play any other game for that. Albion's all about full loot, open world PvP, and corrupted dungeons just are not that. So if Albion's main selling point is its open world PvP, especially full loot open world PvP, how is solo play for that then? Can players do solo PvP in the open world? And despite what many people might say, the answer is definitely yes, although it is worse than it used to be. Solo open world PvP right now is actually decent except for two big problems: the difficulty of it or harsh learning curve, and the overall lack of content for a solo player. With patch after patch of ganking nerfs, solo open world PvPers were really hit the hardest by this, as it just lowered and lowered the amount of potential targets you can go for as a solo player. So due to the lack of content now, you essentially have two options as a solo open world PvPer. The first is to make the PvPing a side activity in the open world and instead focus on things like gathering and PvM, and the second is to do some flagging in the red zone. Basically, if you want to do open world stuff in the black zone, there simply isn't enough possible targets for you to gank, and there isn't that many people in solos or duos for consensual PvP, so fights are few and far between. So really, you can play for 2 hours to get 15 minutes of content, or you can just move the PvP to the side and just do it when you find a target, but focus more on things like gathering and killing mobs in the open world instead to sort of kill the downtime. It's not really a bad activity to do, it's just less focused on PvP than it was before. However, just because there's less content doesn't mean there's any less groups that will try to hunt you down, keeping the high risk and difficulty that it's always had. On the other hand, if you really just want a PvP, you have the option of going into the red zone and flagging up. Now, this style of solo PvP was also hit by the ganking nerfs, and so you do have less content than before, but typically in the red zone we'll have lots of content no matter what, so it's not as much of an issue. The real problem comes in the difficulty. The systems that SBI created to make the red zone into this sort of intro to full loot PvP zones make being an aggressive player very difficult. I'm not going to go too deep into it, but if you're flagged in the red zone looking for PvP, especially if you're hard flagged, you will always be at a massive disadvantage. That's just how the red zone is created and balanced. So if you want to go solo on top of that, which is already one of the largest disadvantages, you're left with some very difficult content. Mainly this makes it hard to get into for newer players, and for more experienced ones lowers the potential of the activity. So for example, lowers the amount of big kills and the size of your profits. Now don't get me wrong, both of these make for decent content, it's just not amazing content, and it's really not high reward either. Sure, if you go to the black zone and do some solo PvP, it can be some great reward, and often it is quite a great reward, but that mainly comes from the other things that you're doing alongside the PvP to tie in the downtimes, like the gathering in the PVM, not from the PvP itself. And while they are not bad content, I'm talking about that in terms of an experienced player. Solo PvP in the open world is classically an activity that requires a lot of experience to be able to pull off effectively. There's a reason you may get ganked by a giant group every time you go and venture out into the black zone, and I can go out with flat 4 and make it all the way up to 8.3 without dying once. And that's simply that I have hundreds of hours more experience than you going solo in the black zone. Solo open world PvP is very hard, and it's not that the learning process can't be fun, it's just that there's a very harsh learning curve. You have to die a ton before you can really start being successful. So really, when it comes to solo open world PvP in the current state of Albion, it's a hell of a lot worse than it used to be. That is true. But overall, I would say it's still okay. It's not great, but it's still definitely possible. You still can make a decent amount of money. It just requires more patience and more learning. So exactly the opposite of what we just talked about in PvP, PvM for a solo player in Albion is probably at one of the best states it's ever been in. Not only is it fast, you can level up your weapons and armor super fast now, but you also have a lot of viable options to do so. People like to complain about things like solo dungeons, saying their loot is terrible now, and that's true, it is a lot worse than it was before, but that's just because their identity has changed into being something that's less risk and less reward compared to how they used to be high risk, high reward. For solo PvM in Albion, there honestly is right now just a good mix of challenging, high risk, high reward content, and also lower risk, lower reward activities. Now there's no like super fun raid level solo sort of content in Albion, but it's Albion. There is no sort of raid level content, period. The best we have is Avalonian dungeons, and those aren't, you can barely call those raids compared to things like WoW, where I have like world first runs and things like that. Like Albion just isn't that type of game. In terms of PvM, the solo PvM is right up there with the group PvM. It's definitely just as good, if not better. The only real criticism I have with solo PvM is that the more new player options like solo dungeons and open world mobs aren't that great for making silver. Now, I just talked about how there's lots of good options for a solo player to do PvM, however, there's a really big problem with the PvM and pretty much all other money-making methods for a solo player, and that's that the top tier ones are very unfriendly to new players. For starters, if we just look at PvM, solo PvM has some of the best potential moneymakers in the game for solo players. Raiding Corrupted Dungeons, for example, are very, very good money, competitive with pretty much all other moneymakers out there, group or solo. The problem is that it's pretty high risk, especially if you don't have the money to invest in a really good clearing set and the time and deaths to invest into learning how to do it effectively and optimizing your clear paths. Similarly, soloing static dungeons and the bosses and chests is something a solo player can do for an absolute stupid amount of money, but the problem again is that if one flat 4 rat comes at the wrong time, he can easily kill you, making it a pretty high risk activity. Things like this are just not really feasible for newer players because they can't take that big of a risk. The other best ways of making money in the game also are solo player friendly, but again, not for new players and players that are just learning the game. For example, refining, crafting, and gathering are extremely profitable once you get really high spec, but early on, they're absolute nightmares to try to do. Gathering takes forever to level up, especially without learning points. If you don't want to lose a ton of money while crafting early on if you don't have spec, you need to do like hours and hours of market research and spreadsheeting to figure that out. And refining is only minorly profitable with focus until you really have high spec again. So in terms of money making, all of them are related to some serious account progression and investment. Now, I'm not saying that a newer solo player can't make a lot of money, like solo dungeons for example still do give a decent amount of money and they're pretty good new player environment. But those sort of more newer friendly solo player activities just don't really stack up to the more newer player friendly group activities in the game. When you're starting out and trying to get that money for premium and then to pay off your next premium and also get some account progression, it's just simply easier to do as a group player than a solo player in the current state of Albion. One of the things that changed recently in Albion was the ability for solo players to participate in their guild's sort of season point objectives without having to get involved with other players. So you can be a solo player and still contribute to your guild, which is a very good change for solo players. The extent to which you can help out is pretty minor, but it is still there. You still can earn some season points for your guild doing everything solo. And while this is sort of like an objectively good change for solo players, it's almost had the opposite effect because you can really now see how much you're missing as a solo player. You can't, as a solo player, even come close to group activities when it comes to farming for might and favor and getting those season rewards like the battle mounts. I've heard way too many solo players be complaining about the might and favor systems and how they feel like they're being punished for playing solo by not getting rewarded in might and favor, and how it's not fair that solo players can't compete with group activities for might and favor, which is true, but it's just a weird issue. In terms of season objectives for a solo player's experience, objectively it's good, it's better than it was before, and it's in a good place, the best it's ever been. But subjectively, it's in this bad place where you're just constantly reminded that group players get better rewards than you. Now, I don't really know how to interpret that in terms of how good the game is for solo players, so it's not going to be considered in my conclusion. Rather, I put it in sort of as an interesting note on solo play. Let me know what you think about this issue in the comments. So where does this all leave us? Well, in terms of PvE, as in everything that's not PvP, it's a very good game for solo players. The only really bad thing is that it's a little bit grindy at the start with a lack of great money makers, as well as the difficulty of gathering and crafting, but overall it's pretty darn good. For PvP, on the other hand, it's a little bit less certain. First and foremost though, if you are someone that enjoys corrupted dungeons, enjoys playing corrupted dungeons, if you try out the game and figure out that you like doing corrupted dungeons, this game is absolutely amazing for solo players. You'll likely have an incredibly fun time and it's just gonna be a great experience. But if you're like me and most of the people I know, and you don't like corrupted dungeons, or you end up not liking corrupted dungeons, well, that's a different story. Really, it comes down to what you look for in a game, what kind of person you are, and your mindset. Objectively, Albion provides some decent PvP content for solo players. It can be really fun and rewarding, but it's definitely not for everyone. So if you're a new player or someone looking to get into Albion and want to be a solo player, just know this. If you don't enjoy challenging yourself, you probably won't have that much fun. You need to do some grinds to develop your account and practice going into unfavorable PvP situations. You're gonna die a lot and struggle for a while before being successful. But once you get there, it can be a lot of fun. It may not be the fastest paced, most action-packed content, but in terms of an open world PvP experience, it's really great once you're good at it. Just be aware also that fundamentally it is a group game, so things like the rewards for solo PvP and most other solo play aren't always going to stack up to group content. If, on the other hand, you're an experienced player, maybe someone that's played solo in Albion for a while, you first and foremost need to realize that Albion is not the game that it used to be. If you can't play the game now without thinking of how it used to be, you're probably not going to enjoy it that much. But if you're able to view the game for how it is, you'll probably realize that overall it's still a pretty decent game for solo PvP, and chances are you'll still have a lot of fun. So looking at it all together, I would say since Albion is fundamentally a PvP game and the solo PvP is decent at best, then overall Albion is a decent game for solo players, under the one caveat that you enjoy a good challenge. I think it's gotten a worse reputation than it deserves just because of how good it used to be, but if you ignore how it was and just look how it is today, I would describe it as decent. Looking at the future of solo play in Albion, I have mixed feelings. On one hand, it has steadily gotten worse over time. Patch after patch that has been implemented, content update after content update for the entire history of Albion has led to the game being less solo friendly. That is very worrying. But on the flip side, we know for a fact that it is on SBI's radar and they're actively looking to improve the experience for solo players. For example, one thing coming in 2022 in Albion is the Mists of Avalon, which are a solo player only open world type environment. Now, if you watched my 2022 Dev Talk review video, I'm not super pumped for these. I don't think they're going to be super successful. I don't think they're going to be very good even, but they will offer some more content, and more open world content, even if it's not the best content, is still greatly needed for solo PvP. So all things considered, looking towards the future, I think Albion is at a critical point when it comes to solo play. If it doesn't turn around soon and continues on its path, there's not much left before it just flops over and dies. A couple more big content patches that push solo play more to the side and it's just gonna fall off of a cliff and disappear. But on the other hand, this year could be the start of the turnaround. It could start getting better for solo players, and if it continues on that path, maybe, just maybe, it could get back to the point of being a solo player's dream game. We can hope, I can hope, and hopefully, SBI can deliver.